Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you for having me on this wonderful conference. I'm very sad that I couldn't be there in person. I was looking forward to the event, but unfortunately, due to some unexpected management issues at my home institutions, I had to stay in Copenhagen, Denmark, to take care of my team. But it's a pleasure to join you online, and I'm looking forward to engage as much as possible with your community, with the conference. I was just following all the introductory speeches, and I can already by now congratulate the organizers with what looks like a really amazing program. What I will be introducing is this sort of framework for how to map and trace some of the impacts of research and research infrastructures that are not always getting noticed or might not always be captured by some of the standard metrics used for research evaluation and even evaluation of investments in infrastructures and similar programs. So my argument to you this morning will be that we need to look a little bit more carefully and give ourselves the challenge of turning the intangible into something just a little bit more tangible by looking at the right places for some of the, yes, exactly as Claire said, some of the micro impacts we are creating. I won't spend a lot of time on my own CV because Claire was so friendly just to introduce most of it. But I will just convey the simple message so that you know where I'm coming from. I'm myself is a full-time academic professor in science communication and in impact studies, but I also happen to take up a number of advisory roles, working at the crossroad or at the interface between science and policy making. So perhaps what you will notice also in this presentation is definitely also a couple of concepts that I wouldn't call necessarily scientific, but that both in Europe, north of Europe, in Canada, in the US, in Japan, other places are really driving policy making currently. One of them definitely being this notion of impact, as I'm sure most of you would agree. You can say, if you like, that I consider myself an impactologist. I'm looking for new species, mapping activities and outputs and outcomes, and also all the different types of interactions and relationships that researcher and research platforms and infrastructures are establishing to their surroundings. So that might both be internal to science, how we collaborate, how we co-author papers, how we cite each other, how we display signals of mobility, changing institution, and by those means also exchanging knowledge. But what is occupying myself mostly these days and the team in Copenhagen is to understand the mobility of knowledge in and outside the university and the community of research. So how do we establish all these, you can call them impact pathways, all the relationships that later on can be utilized and turned into vehicles for impact, but at the same time might not look as important interactions in the first place. So the whole idea of understanding impact more as a question of scalability and less of a question of breakthroughs is something that's occupying me. So we have developed and also published a couple of impact taxonomies and even created, if you like, sort of an evolutionary theory of these impact pathways, focusing in particular, as you will also see and notice in this presentation, on what I here have called co-constituency. And what I mean by that is that it takes two to tango, and it takes even more partners if you want to create impact driven by knowledge, evidence, data, and science. You really need to work together with your stakeholders and partners and collaborators, because those are, in the end of the day, the ones responsible for creating change. And whether we like to acknowledge that or not, really researchers ourselves, even universities, no matter how powerful these institutions are, cannot dictate change in society. So that is knowledge uptake, new industries, new legislation, new change of attitudes. This requires exactly that the stakeholders and collaborators and the people responsible for change is brought on board. And I'm not the first person to mention that the sooner we can bring them on board, the more readiness we can create for impact that's gonna scale later in the research project. So take it for what it is. I don't know if impactology is a well-established term. I'm sure it's not, but this is a way of describing these different dimensions of impact that often gets lost when we are only looking at final effects. I wanted to just briefly mention the European context in which I'm operating myself. Denmark has just taken over the presidency of the European Union. So for the next 6 months, we are hosting the presidency, and I myself is chair of one of the high-level meetings on research evaluation. And I found this quote from our former EU commissioner quite informative for the discussion at your conference. She says here that I believe in a research culture that recognizes a diversity of contributions to science, but also to society, and that celebrates at the same time high quality and high impact research that that values sharing of knowledge, collaboration, and integrity, including engagement with society. So I think this is what we are looking at in terms of creating impact. It's really a multifaceted exercise in which we have to both focus at the same time on quality and on impact, as it were. Yeah, let me skip this one. I think one major obstacle for really understanding the nature of impact has been this notion of the linear model, or the linear fallacy, as I call it in this slide. Really, we have a strong belief across funding agencies, I think also universities, that if we are just allocating enough funding at the one end of the knowledge tunnel, we will, in the end of the day, see research outputs being generated. And then, interestingly enough, at least for the last 25 years, we have in the Western world and across our funding agencies, we have been very occupied by capturing all knowledge production in the form of research publications. So research publications have really become the main vehicle for not only dissemination of research, but also for rewards and recognition and promotion, and also for research evaluation. And we have also had a quite narrow and selective understanding of what impact then means, namely the traceable impact from publications. And I'm of course sorry, also with a little bit, you wouldn't be able to see that at the distance, a little bit of a blink in my eye. I'm sorry and I'm sure I'm not the first one to say that really creating impact in society is not only and not primarily driven by publications. Publications are good for many things, obviously, for sharing our research, sharing our findings, but also for maintaining high integrity and high quality. It's a golden standard for peer review. But most of our partners and collaborators in society, they actually do not read our publications. They actually do not go to the journals we are struggling to publish in and get a subscription for multiple thousand Canadian dollars and then start downloading the papers and reading them and then running out into society, changing it. And no matter how unfortunate this situation is, it has been accelerated by an industry of publishing houses that have, as a matter of fact, provided the entire data infrastructure of modern science. So almost no matter where you're looking in current day universities or funding agencies, they are maintained and supported by data coming primarily from publishing entities. It's commercial data, it's profitable data. To a large extent, it's closed data, proprietary data that are driven by our publications and the way these publications are not only downloaded and cited, but also read. But as I said before, it's unfortunate and it's an empirical fact that the impact can be created in multiple ways, of which citations of journal articles obviously is only one. So perhaps we have to take a fresh look at the research process itself, whether it is utilizing large infrastructures or data sharing facilities, or whether it is a small project within humanities in archaeology. What we have seen in several of the studies we've conducted, and also that's been published in the literature, is really that research impact can start already at the outset of the project or the program. You can ask stakeholders, ask your collaborators from both other disciplines as well as from industry or policy or civil society, patients, for example, what kind of questions would they like to ask? So that's already a micro impact right there, establishing a relationship even before there is a research project funded. It might be that you want to invite your stakeholders to co-create data. You might want them to even validate it, to ask them questions, to engage in dissemination, and create a platform really that is open for participation. And in this sense, you don't often wait around until you have final publications and then, start disseminating the findings that have been published. What you do is really to engage and collaborate as the main vehicle for impact, not just disseminating DOI files or publishable work. And I think we have to take that notion quite seriously. So impact is a lot of different things. It's of course publications and citations, it's IP, but it's also research collaboration. That's already relational impact. It's consultancy. You could call that conceptual impact. It's advisory roles. It's informal collaboration, sharing data, providing feedback, engaging in knowledge exchange, or even communicating science to a broader audience. All of these forms really count as forms of impact, but as you can see here on the picture, they are most often belonging to sort of the deep sea at the Arctic Ocean. We have a tendency to only focus on the top of the iceberg when we want to conduct impact evaluations. Whereas what is really important is to understand the entire iceberg and the entire ontology of our different activities and how they can become traceable and measurable in the end of the day. That's really what counts. Just to give you one idea about how this can play out, this is a survey we made with 1,300 respondents from science. They were selected based on their publication profile. So they had all been publishing at least 2 papers in a peer-reviewed international journal within the last year. And we wanted to ask them about the granularity or the characteristics of what they considered to be their own impact. And as you can imagine, at the more sort of well-described level, you would find exactly things like research collaboration, but also commissioned research. So that's when there is an explicit stakeholder willing basically to pay for the research, but also IP, especially in the STEM disciplines, technology transfer, patents, royalties. But then, interestingly enough, most of the respondents were actually answering our questions by giving us a whole diversity of other types of impact that they were creating in their everyday research practice. For example, and mostly not accounted for by councils or foundations or even universities ourselves, reports, advice, testimony, participation, meetings, events, seminars, networks, platforms. So a meeting like the one you are participating in today, in most impact exercises and even in most research evaluations, would never get accounted for. There might be some dark place in your university website where you can make a small hint that you attended a meeting. But the idea that meetings or conferences are creating micro impacts by connecting people with each other, we simply do not take account for. And it gets even worse. This is where we saw actually most of the activities of practicing scientists: knowledge brokering, providing input, testing a hypothesis, learning together, supervising, quality assurance, helping a company to get started, or helping a government agency to clarify a question. So this everyday interaction with society most of the time simply is not part of what we consider to be impact. And to my own mind, this is in a certain sense a tragedy that we are only focusing on these macro impacts while not really taking into account all the everyday interactions we engage in. Let me see here. So basically, you do not always need a major breakthrough at the front page of Nature or Science. Sometimes what you really need to do is to create a cascade or a cluster of micro impacts. So really being able to promote change at a micro social level and working with your stakeholders, collaborators, with participants from different disciplines. So building your impact portfolio bottom up is actually what leads to scalable change and readiness later on, rather than sort of waiting for that one decisive moment in which you land on the front page of Science and have that sort of moment of clarity where you can really sort of claim your impact. In certain sense, I understand that this is part of the political reality that we want to celebrate science, but most impact from all scientific institutions actually is created by micro shifts in practice, in belief, mindset, in policy and behavior, and even in industry. So the way industry is transitioning from one technology to a new one is often not driven by one breakthrough. It's driven by a whole cluster of enabling conditions that needs to be in place. I hope you get the picture I'm trying to paint here. So we created this framework, and I'm happy to share more resources if any of you are curious how to actually start tracing this. It sort of comes from the world of impact tracing or outcome harvesting. So those are evaluation theories that are focusing more on productive interactions rather than final impact. And it's sort of perhaps a little bit of a paradox that as an expert on impact assessment, I would ask you to focus more on your activities, more on your outcomes, than on your final impacts. But it has to do with scalability, and it also has to do with time and time scales, that really for us to understand final impacts of any given piece of research, whether it is in psychiatry, archaeology, or biomedical, you need at least 10 to 12, even according to some studies, 15 years in order really to map and understand the impact of any given research program or research infrastructure for that matter. And what you will see if you are trying to follow sort of the impact trail of any type of project or discipline is that it is co-created by so many other different interacting parts. But what it makes a lot of sense to then start understanding what's our impact, what can we do in our immediate sphere of influence. So when you look again at your activities, at your stakeholders, how you work to enrich or enhance a particular technology or data set, how you get on with your collaborators, how often you meet with them, if you create partnerships, if you create value in those organizations. So those immediate sort of, again, small scale impacts are really what is driving scalability later on. So rather than waiting 5 or 10 years to hire some consultant to tell you that you did great in your program, perhaps you want to start measuring or even tracing some of your more immediate, or I don't know, lack of a better word, some of your intermediary impacts. So those are the impacts that are already emerging in the process of conducting research or utilizing your infrastructure. So the feedback you get from stakeholders, from collaborators, from all the people who are part of your program is exactly not impacts, but actually outcomes. It changes something for them without at that given point in time to capture final change. So look at that. You can look it up if you like. Productive interactions is a much more empirically driven bottom-up concept of research impact than our established, more linear narrative. And some of you might wonder, okay, it sounds all great what David is saying, and perhaps most of this is not completely news to you. I hope it's not. But are we not sacrificing our scientific quality if we start having all these micro interactions with collaborators? And at least preliminary data is showing that actually the more we collaborate with external stakeholders and the more we bring our partners into our research process, actually the more citations our final publications are getting. So we can actually trace even societal impact in the academic literature, which means that if you have co-authored or worked with industry or policy or civil society in the research process, there is a small citation reward simply, and it's quite intuitive. Those papers are simply more interesting even to the scientific community itself than papers that are, if you like, purely driven by internal cognitive interest, even though, of course, we all know that those papers might serve a different purpose. But at least when colleagues raised the concern that impact is sacrificing excellence, we actually do not see that in the data. Okay, let's see here. Missions, partnerships. I think I already touched upon this, so let me skip. I don't know how happy we are with the big tech billionaires at this point in time. But one thing they came up with, Eric Schmidt, when he exited from Google, was this notion of focused research organizations and research infrastructures. I found that to be quite interesting, new, what also I believe Claire called platform science. It has to do with the fact that these research platforms take on problems that require a greater level of collaboration or even systems engineering that is than what is possible within any given individual research group. So they might be producing actually a public good that a venture capital fund or even a university wouldn't be able actually to fund in the first place. So again, you can think about big program investments or even infrastructure investments. These focused research organizations are indeed focused on solving some challenges and producing public goods. But interestingly enough, in this program that has also been supported now by the National Science Foundation in the US and by the UK government, most of the results from a research platform or research infrastructure is neither profitable on the short term, so you cannot do a patent or a spin out in the short term. And interestingly enough, nor is the value added publishable. So you cannot describe the impact of a research infrastructure, for example, only in terms of the number of publications it's creating, exactly because it is enabling publications at a later stage rather than producing publications itself. So even though this initiative has been launched from private investment, I find it quite interesting that at this level of influence, you have policymakers and philanthropists understanding that science simply is much more than what is profitable and what is publishable, which, by the way, and most of you would know this, is exactly what is defining incentives and rewards in science. So among our scientific institutions, if we cannot publish, we need to produce profitable companies. If we don't produce startups, we have at least to show publications. But there seems to be a complete sort of white space between publishability and profitability, which is this capacity building, this sort of enabling force of scientific platforms or infrastructures that simply is not so well described in our current reward structures. So I'm just going to end by giving you one example. We're at my own institution in Denmark have been developing new research indicators, and we try a little bit to act as we preach. So of course, as you can imagine, we're a university-based organization, a public university. So obviously publications do mean a lot, but they only account for 70% of our key performance indicators. The remaining 30% is now driven by broader impact criteria. So this has been captured by 3 different categories that the researchers are now getting measured on. One is collaboration, another one is visibility, and the third one is openness. So open data, open access, but also open innovation and open communication. And it's just to give you a snapshot that you can actually turn these ideas into practical reality. This is also used as a funding allocation model. So departments at my own university that is performing well on selected criteria in both of these parts of the indicator are also being rewarded for it. So it's also changing not much, but a little bit of funding, and by that those means also changing incentives in the research system. So I hope you can see my argument here is that you can turn these broader impacts and this sort of traceability into something much more tangible that actually works in the everyday promotion and tenure and reward at a university like my own. Not gonna say much more about that. Also not building the impact, forget about it. I'm gonna end by just emphasizing that what I have been saying these last 25 minutes is also very much emerging at the global level and at the European level as a new sort of policy agenda. So in 2 months from now, I think actually exactly 2 months, we are hosting a high-level conference in Copenhagen on reforming research assessment and actually including these micro impacts in the official frameworks for evaluating universities, but also research infrastructures. And again, this is an attempt to include a wider spectrum of performances, openness, transparency, but also collaboration, the work we do on equality and diversity, the work we do on care and collegiality, so networking, mentorships, supervision, all has to count in research evaluation. And I know it's probably a little bit too late, but if any of you are around in December, I would be very happy to extend an invitation for you to join the 300 plus high-level representatives that will now discuss how we get from principle to practice and developing real-world instruments for impact assessment that actually works across funding agencies and universities in Europe and globally. And on that note, I'm gonna end my presentation. Thank you for the attention.